Tonight we're blessed to have our Bible study led by a campus pastor from Luther College. Through the years, my children have attended college there. I've had the privilege of hearing Pastor David Vasquez preach and teach and watched him in action. So it's a great privilege then to be able to invite him to come to be with us. I remember a few years ago when David was working on his D-Min, and he told me what he was working on, that he was studying the theme of migration in Scripture. And as I continued my daily devotional reading, I was just stunned at how I had not seen this theme that is so persistent in the Old and the New Testament. So let's give David a warm hand of welcome and let him have as much time as possible to teach us.
I got a fan club over there as we gather around the church with local events, including this conversation here at the Synod. Many of us have traveled together on these events, connecting the church and experiencing the beauty and diversity of the church, get to be pretty close to each other. So it is great to be with you today. And thank you, Bishop Anderson, for your invitation and the invitation of the Synod and the Planning Committee to be here and to be in partnership with you and also with the larger church. So, as you already mentioned, as Bishop Anderson already pointed out, there's a lot of connections between us, and it doesn't take very much for us to figure out our connections. You probably have heard, let's see, here we go. We'll go back to you've heard of 6 degrees of connection, or 6 degrees of separation rather, than if you go around, the basic idea is, and you meet just some random stranger somewhere, and you begin to kind of work who you know and to think about who they know, eventually there'll be a way in which you will be connected. And so it takes about 6 different degrees of separation that all humans in the world, the idea is, are divided by 6 degrees of separation. Now, some new research has happened. There's been a few things going on. The theme of this agenda, of this assembly, is being based on our banner here, Journey with Jesus, and this text from Emmaus. And a question that Jesus asks in there is, so what things? Jesus is heading out of town, or the disciples are, following a major crisis in their lives. And as they're making their way out of town, they're looking kind of downcast. Jesus comes up to them, as Bishop Anderson explored in worship, and he says, so what things? Like Jesus pretends that he has no idea what's going on, right? Anyway, what's going on in our world today? One of the things that's going on in our world today is that we are increasingly more connected, right? There's been this major explosion of social media. How many of you are on Facebook? All right, so see, that's another connection. How many of you use Twitter? All right, so a few or less. We could do a little market research and say all of this. How much do Lutherans use each of the various mediums? But anyway, recent research shows that because of that because of the boom in social media, this old idea that we are connected by 6 degrees of separation is actually shrinking, and we're down to somewhere around 4 degrees of separation, just because of all the different ways in which we connect. Because many of us have thousands of friends now on Facebook. Isn't that great? I mean, we have thousands of friends, right? Of course, what they haven't discovered yet, what research hasn't looked at yet, is an even increasingly more particular phenomenon in human connections. And it is the Lutheran 2 degrees of separation. Okay? So if you've been to many Lutheran events, as we traveled around the church, talking about this idea of local, introducing this word and this connection of our ministry locally and globally, it doesn't take very much to sit around the table at any synod assembly, any event of the church, and very quickly find out who you know. So we could begin, as Bishop Anderson has done, by mentioning the folks that we have in common with each other. His 3 kids who have graduated from Luther, Caitlin, Sean, and Laura, his wife, Robin, who is also a Luther alum, or his brother-in-law, Kevin. Robin's brother was actually my doctor in Decorah. So see, it's a very small, it doesn't take a lot of degrees of separation within a Lutheran tradition. We could also say my connections to this synod, I would imagine I would find a connection with many of you who may have met Mary and Aaron Sumala-Folkers, who served at Prairie Land Lutheran Church here in the Synod. Where are the folks from Prairie Land Lutheran? All right, they're back there. So greetings from the Sumala-Folkers. My brother-in-law and sister-in-law, Mary and Aaron, served out there for 5 years before they moved back closer to home in Moorhead a couple of years back. And one of the things I loved to do when I went down to Prairie Land Lutheran to visit them in LaSalle and Hanska, there were 3 highlights that we had to do every time we went to visit them and visit our little nephew Paul. The first one was we needed to make a run to St. James to have some good Mexican tacos. They have the best carne asada tacos in all of the Midwest in St. James. So where are folks from St. James? All right, did you bring some tacos? All right, well, next time. All right, the next thing, of course, then we have to go to the other side to New Ulm and get some good German beer. All right, so that's the place to go for that. And, of course, you just go right down the street to Hanska for the Sitte de Mai celebration and celebrate our Norwegian heritage. Or at least theirs, but it was fun. Lots of connections around the world in an increasingly connected world. As we gather here at Gustavus Adolphus, the name alone reminds us of the many connections we have already within the Lutheran tradition around the world. Those connections are built right into the names of our institutions. I mean, who names an institution Gustavus Adolphus? That's a pretty complex name, right? You name him after a Swedish king because as the college embraces its own identity, it is proud, as its mission statement says, to be deeply rooted in its Swedish and Lutheran heritage. Which one comes first, Lutheran or Swedish, depends on which group you're hanging out with, right? So, for example, if you're down at Luther College, where I serve as one of the campus pastors, you're probably going to emphasize the Swedish part, since there's already the Lutheran connection. Luther has a deep, also proud history of connections to be rooted in the Lutheran Church and higher education, but also in its Norwegian ancestry and the commitment that a group of Norwegian immigrants made to educate their children and their future leaders, not for their own sake only, but for the sake of the world. And if you start looking a little closely on when these institutions were formed, the one we are gathered in here at Gustavus or Luther, anybody know what years these were established? 1860, 1861. What was going on? You know, Jesus asked the disciples, this is the question I want you to keep thinking about. So what things? Jesus sort of pretends that he does not know what's going on around him, as an invitation to the disciples to think and pay attention to what things are going on around us. And as they begin to tell him that, Jesus turns around and tells them, in light of Scripture, how to read the things that are going on around them. So it's always good in Scripture to look at the questions. They help to open up what we might be thinking about. So one question to think about is, what things were going on in 1860 when our institutions were founded of higher education? When Norwegians and Swedes decided that as they came into this place, into this new country of theirs, that they would educate their people. Of course, as you well know, we were in the middle of a civil war in this country. Imagine the courage of those immigrants who came from far away, who had only barely any resources, and in the middle of a war that was tearing apart their very young nation. And yet they had the vision and the commitment to create new possibilities, to create institutions that continue to serve 150 years later, and that have become much broader in their spectrum of service and commitment. And yet they have maintained their identity, both as Lutheran institutions and deeply rooted in their Swedish and Norwegian community. Thankfully, we have places like Augustana College, also represented here. I don't know, where's Paul? Pastor Paul Rohde, one of my colleagues here. I don't know where Paul went. He's out there somewhere. Make sure to stop by the Augustana table as well. Thankfully, Augustana helped those Norwegians and those Swedes come together and found a college together as well about at the same time. Now, how many of you are from St. Cloud? Oh, big group. And everybody's kind of, oh yeah, you guys are like synod, by synod areas, right? Okay, that's why you're all together. You're not trying to kind of separate from outstate. Here's St. Cloud, there's outstate, right? So, migration, this connection across the world, these connections because of boats that crossed an ocean, was not limited only to our Lutheran institutions, churches, or traditions. It's the way that our entire country was shaped. St. Cloud is where it is for a couple of reasons. One is pretty basic. There's a river there. It's always good to put a city near water, so you don't have to drag it too far. After all, we are, about 75–80% water? So we kind of need a lot of water. So we need to be tributaries to some river near us, right? The water comes through us and it goes right back into the river. So we are tributaries of some water near us. So that's one reason that St. Cloud was placed where it is. But there's another reason as well why St. Cloud was placed where it is. And that is the Red River trails that crisscross from up in Canada, bringing product, primarily fur at the beginning, down to St. Paul, where then they would be placed in barges and distributed across the country. Those trails would be traveled by these ox carts, hundreds of them, huge caravans of them that would travel sometimes 2 to 3 miles long. And they traveled primarily a couple of different trails that crisscross, again, from Canada around Winnipeg down to St. Paul. And people will make their way there, and if you notice on this map here, 2 of those trails would come together right at the river where St. Cloud is today. What that trading did, as these caravans would come and go through that area, is this. This is a population graph for St. Cloud. If you're feeling a little crowded, this is why, right? You can see that at the beginning, this is that every 10 years we count heads. You know, just like in the Bible, they start counting heads everywhere. Every so often, they all stop in the middle of the desert and they start counting heads. Make sure we haven't lost anybody. Like when you're on a mission trip and you go, okay, people count off. So, okay, we do that nationally. It takes a little longer. But every 10 years, we do this head count. And you can see what's happened in St. Cloud. As people from Sweden, Norway, France, Britain, many other places began to make their way to this community. And what they were doing is they were following trade. The trails went through there. How many of you, again, the group from St. James that is here, I found this to be a fascinating picture. I don't know who took it in St. James, but it's a part of the crowd. I don't think it's the whole town, but a pretty good group. And they're out in the middle of town in St. James. And St. James is also located where it is because of a particular trail. In this case, the trail that eventually replaced the ox carts. As you know, the United States was settled as the trains began to move in. As they were trying to decide how to get from Minneapolis to Sioux City, St. James is right in the middle. So 2 officers from the train company decided, we're going to put a town here. We're going to call it St. James. And then people began to come. And they came in droves until you can see at about 1910, when that trading of the trains began to falter. And things began to shift. The population shifted with the trade. And then when Downs, a food company, moved into town in 1940s, the population began to pick up again. So, 6 degrees of separation, move down to 4, and within communities, they go down to 2. We are extremely interconnected to one another. And we often follow those connections as we move around the world, around our communities. Because one of the things that we always do as human beings is that we follow the people we care for, and we follow trade. Think about the story of Joseph in the Bible. Y'all familiar with Joseph? Give you a little bit of background to remind you of it all. So Joseph is in the story in Genesis, and it's one of the longest stories in the Bible. It's really great. It begins at about chapter 36 in Genesis, and it goes all the way till the end. And it is a complete work that is really worth sitting down and just reading straight through. Anyway, you know the basic story of Joseph. Joseph was one of 12 brothers, and they had a very wise father named Jacob. In his infinite wisdom, Jacob decided that he would give preference to one of his sons, to Joseph. And that went over really well with his brothers, right? Some of the ways, do you remember, in what ways did Jacob show his preference for Joseph? A coat, a multicolored coat. We could all break out into song. Now, it's interesting that even though there was no Vogue magazine in the day, we still get a pretty good description of this coat a few thousand years later. We're told that this was a multicolored coat. The language in Hebrew is a little confusing and it's often translated as fancy or long-sleeved. It's a little unclear. But we get a description of this coat from thousands of years ago. Why? Who cares? Well, because the coat mattered. It mattered that it was many colors, because that meant that it was really expensive. Because getting color was kind of hard to create color. Secondly, it mattered that it had long sleeves, because it meant status. Because Joseph didn't do a lot of work. When you put on a fancy robe with long sleeves that flow, how many of you farm or have worked in the farm? So let's give them a hand and give them thanks for the food we have. If you have worked out in a farm, you know that you better not go out there to work in long, fanciful, long sleeves like this. It won't work very well. It is dangerous because you're going to get chewed up by some machine as it gets caught. So this coat that Jacob in his infinite wisdom gave to Joseph marked him as somebody of status and somebody with privilege and somebody who didn't have to work. Anyway, so you remember the story that Jacob then decided to get even smarter. And this time, he sent out his son, again, Joseph. He's the number 11 in the family, to boot. Okay, so if you're going to have a favorite son, it better not be the little snot-nosed kid who's number 11, because you're going to have a lot of trouble. And he sends Joseph out to check up on his brothers. And Joseph says, okay, Dad. He goes out, and he can't find his brothers. Go back and read the story. Joseph is sort of wandering around the hills. He has no idea where his brothers are. Why doesn't he know? Because he doesn't work. He doesn't know where they are at. But in the story, he asks some random people, and they tell him, oh yeah, they're down in Dothan. Everybody else seems to know where his brothers are. And how do they know? Because they're down by the trail, by where all the trading happens. That's where Dothan is. And there's a train that goes through there, an ox cart type of trail. There is a train that goes through there. It is made up not of oxen, but perhaps of camels. The caravans that would go through to pick up produce, everything that was grown by Jacob's children, and everybody in that area was brought to Dothan to sell. And then, from there, it would follow the trade up or down into Egypt. People follow trade. They always have, they always will. It was the Swedes who came here following trade and seeking opportunity. The Norwegians did the same. They set up places like St. Cloud and St. James right on the trail, where the trade would allow them to survive and to remain connected, increasingly so, from 6 degrees to 4 to 2. And as they were connected one to another, they found in their own well-being the connection that they found. So for example, when Joseph's older brothers later in life run out of food and they have trouble, where do they go? Anybody know where they go when there's a famine in the land, they can't produce enough food? Where do Joseph's brothers go? To Egypt. Why? That's where the product is. And they know the product is there because they have been sending it there for generations. People follow trade. So when there is hunger and need, they get on the bus and they follow the trade. And that's how they ended up in Egypt. When they got there, Joseph plays a little games with them before he tells them who he is. Rosa followed the trade. Rosa is a woman I met just close to where I live in Decorah, but she grew up in Guatemala, where I'm also originally from. Rosa started working when she was very young, like many children in Guatemala. And she started working mostly helping her family in a small plot that they had. And she would farm that land with her family. And as she became just about 8 years old, she began to work outside the home as well. And she would work out in the fields picking roses. Early on, children, because they have small hands, help to transfer the little plants from the pots out into the field. So Rosa did this for a number of years. She got really good at it, started working her way up the company where she worked. And eventually she ended up, not in an outside job, but one indoors. And she ended up shipping. And she would ship these boxes of roses, once they had been cut and prepared, and then she would put labels on them to ship them off. And the labels would read of places she could never imagine. Names like Chicago, Minneapolis, St. Cloud, St. James. Flowers that would be shipped off into this land to the north that she had no idea about. Within a few years, for reasons she couldn't at the time understand, the company she worked for closed shop and moved. And so she was out of a job. The thing started again. She looked for work. This time she ended up working out in another common profession in that area, working in the fields picking coffee. Hard work. She made her way, because of her hard work and her experience prior, back into the shipping department of this coffee place. And then she again would prepare the boxes to ship good-smelling coffee north. And she would label it by putting names of places she had never imagined. Places like Chicago, Minneapolis, St. Cloud, and St. James. About 5 years later, that company also closed. And again, Rosa had no idea why. She didn't know that this had to do with trade agreements that were taking place in this huge network of sales and purchase and trade. That these free trade agreements were impacting the way that companies decided where to locate and how to do business. And so when her job was done and the company closed, and she still had to provide for her children and for her aging parents, and she could find no work in her community, Rosa did what people have done for generations and what people will continue to do. She followed the trade. So where did she go? She went north. Why? Because that's where the trade goes. She knew that the resources were there. And how did she know? Because she had been sending stuff there for 10 years. So she followed the trade. Today we have more people on the move than ever in the history of the world. As we think about all of the biblical stories, as Bishop Anderson already pointed out, when we begin to pay attention, we realize that many of the biblical stories talk about people on the move. People who are either leaving or coming from someplace, following a promise or escaping some kind of difficulty. And these people on the move, when they are on the move, are open in some ways to the divine, and so we get their stories. But today, we have more people on the move than ever in the history of the world. You know, at the end of World War II, there was an estimated 1.5 million refugees of concern. So at the end of World War II, when the United Nations was formed, one of the first things they did is they created the High Commissioner for Refugees. They defined what a refugee was, and then identified that at the end of the largest conflict in human history, there were 1.5 people displaced. That same organization today, the High Commissioner for Refugees, estimates that there are 10.5 million refugees of concern in the world today. 10 times more people than at the end of the largest conflict in human history. Imagine that. It's mind-boggling. And that's just what are called refugees of concern. The numbers of people on the move are significantly larger because we are increasingly connected, because people follow trade, and our trade has hugely increased. We should know this. If you're looking for evidence, make sure to watch Gran Torino. Have any of you watched Gran Torino? All right, I'm glad many of you have. The rest of you, when you get home, homework. Watch Gran Torino. It's a great movie. I think you can see it on Netflix. In Gran Torino, it's a story about community where, an inner city community where most people have moved out. There's been kind of like the white flight of the 60s and 70s. And the folks who have moved in are mostly Hmong families that have been resettled into the community. Well, Clint Eastwood plays this very ornery guy who stayed in the community. He's sticking to his guns and staying in town. And he's got this really tense relationship with his new neighbors. But he strikes an odd friendship with a girl in this Hmong family next door. And there's a great conversation that they have in the, in the cab of his pickup where he's talking with this girl. And it goes something like this. He says to her, "So tell me, who are the Hmong?" And she goes, "It's Hmong." The H is silent. He goes, "Oh, whatever. Why did you people leave the jungle?" And she goes, "We're not from the jungle. We're from the mountains." "Ah, whatever. Why did you come here?" And then she tries to explain the whole connection between South Asia, Hmongs, the Vietnam War, support of the U.S., all of this stuff, and how they ended up displaced. And he's getting tired of this. He doesn't want the details just too much. So finally she says to him the best line in the entire movie, "Blame the Lutherans." Minnesota has 5 times more refugees than most other states in the country, per capita. And the reason is blame the Lutherans. It's because in our tradition, we know what it is like to be on the move. We have known this in our history, because we ourselves have experienced that as we moved around the world, certainly to this country, and founded colleges. We have known that because our brothers and sisters during the World War II were in conflict, and 75 years ago we started Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services. But we have continued to attend to those who are on the move as the waves of those who are on the move continue to change. And we know well that people move for one of 2 reasons, whether it's in biblical times, in the 60s, or today, for either a pull or a push. Abraham was pulled by a promise to follow, a promise to a land he had never seen. Others are pushed, like Ruth, whose book begins in a time of turmoil, when there is famine in the land and the political system has failed. And so Naomi ends up leaving her hometown of Bethlehem and goes to Moab. People move either because of a pull or because of a push. But today we have the largest number of people on who we are exerting this kind of movement, of either a pull or a push. Rosa grew up in Guatemala, where I'm originally from, and she grew up in a small town in the mountains of Guatemala that looks a little bit like this, thanks to Google Maps. I don't know if you can see that image there, it's a little dark. But basically, it's a small town in the mountains. It's about 20 blocks by 10 blocks. So Rosa is the one I spoke about that followed the trade. And she followed that trade, and she ended up in Iowa, about 25 minutes from where I live and work at Luther College, in a small town called Postville, Iowa. This is what Postville looks like. A little town in the hills of northeast Iowa that is about 20 blocks by 10 blocks. So how does somebody get from this little town down here to this little town up here? The same way that the well-traveled yogurt does. Let me introduce you to the well-traveled yogurt here as we wrap things up. The well-traveled yogurt has traveled more than most of us have in our lives. It's just little. It can be purchased right down the street from your home at the local grocery store for about $1, sometimes a little less if it's on sale. But this little container has traveled more than most of us have in our entire lives. Because the milk in this product probably came from a couple of different countries. The little bacteria that makes the yogurt probably came from somewhere else. The fruit that is packaged with it was sourced elsewhere in the world. The ink that makes the little package, or the little metal that makes the little lid, each of these parts, the plastic, come from some other place in the world. We have created the most amazing and complex economic and distribution system in human history. In other words, we have created an incredibly complex trading system. And because people follow trade, we have also created an extremely complex migration experience in the world. Many of those who are migrating because of that push, like the refugees I've spoken of, or even Rosa's own kind of experience, a push perhaps of poverty in her own community and the pull to come here. But many others of us are traveling because of opportunities. Like many of our colleges at Luther, where I serve, in January, this past January, I traveled with 21 students to Israel and Jordan. We were one of 30 groups that traveled abroad for JTRN. We have close to 500 students abroad every January. This is mind-boggling, how many people can travel and how far we can go. 85% of our students will travel abroad before they graduate. Was that your experience for those of you who went to school, maybe college, if you did in the 70s and 80s? Probably not. If you think about your own travel experience and that of your children and grandchildren, in general, unless you're retired and now you started to travel, the experiences of those younger generations is more mobility than our own. That mobility may take him across the world, it might take him across the state, it might take him across the country. We follow trade, and our trade has greatly increased. The good news for us, and what I hope we will spend the rest of our time in Bible study together, is recognizing that as we increase the mobility of our world, as we have opportunities to travel, as we know many people are forced to be on the move because of the things that are happening around us, that we ask ourselves, what things? What's happening? What are the things happening in your neighborhood? Who are the people on the move where your church is in your own life? Bishop Anderson challenged us, invited us at the end of his sermon to think about the communities we serve in, to redefine our mission fields. My invitation is to simply ask each other, your church council, your pastor, your members of your congregations, each other in this gathering, what things? What's happening around us? How is the world changing? And what kind of resources do we have in our tradition, in our history, in our scriptures to speak to them? What Jesus did to his disciples as they walked away from a crisis they had lived, with their hearts heavy and confused, as we sometimes feel when we leave a council meeting, when we look at the numbers in some ways in our communities, in our congregations, in our towns, as we are sometimes heavy-hearted and perhaps a little confused about what to do with all of this transition, with all of this movement. We are like those two disciples walking away from Jerusalem. To them Jesus came, and to us Jesus comes and says, what things? Let's talk about it. And then we are told, he began to open the scriptures to them. So Jesus drew on these ancient texts to help them understand the things that were going on in their lives at that moment. As Lutherans who have only 2 degrees of separation, we can have this conversation in ways that the rest of the society sometimes fails to, because we can do it with hope. We have it in our own history as a church to know times of transition, of scarcity, of fear, as well as opportunity. We have it in our scriptures that we share with many others, these gracious, basic stories of people on the move. And from these we can draw to answer this question, what things? And how do we respond to them? Amen.